Hello students, today we're going to discuss A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell. This short story also has a dramatized version, a one-act play called Trifles, which some of you may have read. Susan Glaspell worked as a journalist, which was very unusual for a woman at the time to have a profession which was traditionally associated with men. She began by writing in the Society page, but ultimately was promoted to cover crime and murder. And while doing that job, she covered the story of a woman who had killed her abusive husband, which, of course, is the basis for A Jury of Her Peers. In the middle of her journalism career, Susan Glaspell decided to attend college despite criticism from her family and society at large in the Midwest. Women who went to college were seen as less marriageable, less attractive to men. But despite all of this, Susan Glaspell did decide to go to college and was very successful. She was on the debate team and often argued feminist positions, and was known to be quite brilliant as a student. She ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize for drama, and she also wrote novels and several short stories. Most of her stories and material did focus on women, women's power, and feminism, and because of this, during the World Wars and immediately after, she was kind of erased from the canon because at that time, women were seen as being domestic creatures. So we have the rise of like the 1950s housewife, which you're probably familiar with. So domesticity was really prized in that period of time. And so critics panned Susan Glaspell for a number of years and really erased her from the American canon. But during the 1970s and 80s, when women's libs started to become more popular, scholars looked back and said, why aren't we talking about Susan Glaspell? And so she's now understood to be one of the most important female dramatists and short story writers in American history. So she has really been added back into the canon because of movements like what you're doing right now, which is taking a women's studies course. So let's talk about the play itself. The play has several important themes. One of those themes is female oppression. And we see this throughout the play, this idea of Mrs. Wright being, I'm sorry, throughout the short story, because Mrs. Wright is slowly kind of squeezed and silenced until she snaps. This has a lot to do with Freudian analysis. We call this psychoanalytic criticism. And this is the idea that if a human being has any need that is not being met, one of our main needs, right? So love, communication, friendship, sex, anger, anything that a person is having to suppress and bury on a long enough timeline, Freud says it's eventually going to come out one way or another. And so ultimately for Mrs. Wright, after being oppressed for so many years, it comes out as a murder. Another theme is the dismissal of women by men. So this short story throws into light how women were thought of by men. So you notice all of the times in the story that the detectives and the husbands kind of laugh at women. They think they're not smart enough to discover evidence. They think that the women are concerned with silly things like preserves and quilting. And they generally think that the women are not really as intellectually capable as themselves. So the play really shows a larger picture of how men viewed women in the early 1900s. And finally, we have this theme of justice and equality. So traditionally, we would probably say justice means that the killer is caught and punished and justice is done. But when we start to bring into light the inequality of the time, then we, as the readers, maybe start to think that justice is the killer getting away with it, right? So we probably feel a little bit happy for Mrs. Wright that she has her crime covered up. So when we bring in these ideas of equity and equality, then black and white justice becomes a little bit harder to see. I also wanted to pull up some symbolism in the story that I think is really important to note. First of all, we have the symbolism of the setting. So it's the middle of winter. It's very cold. It's so cold that the glass preserves in the house have busted. And so that coldness is definitely symbolic of the oppressive nature of Mrs. Wright's life, the coldness of her marriage and her home. We also have a mention of the location of the home itself. One of the neighbor ladies, Mrs. Hale, mentions that the home is in a hollow below the street and that you can't see the house from the road or the road from the house. So that isolation of the home is definitely symbolic of Mrs. Wright's isolation from others because of her husband. We mentioned the jars of preserves. They bust under pressure. It gets so cold that those sealed jars break. And definitely here we have a symbol of, again, Mrs. Wright being under such intense pressure for such a long time, being so oppressed and silenced that she eventually also snaps under pressure. There is the dirty roller towel in Mrs. Wright's kitchen. If you're not familiar with what a roller towel is, you have two kind of long casters, and then around those casters is wrapped a single loop of fabric, kind of like an infinity scarf, if you will. And so you would dry your hands on one side of the cloth, and then you would roll it backwards so that the dry, clean side was now ready for the next person to use. And the men comment on how dirty the roller towel is, and if you notice, the women say, well, men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be, right? So the dirty roller towel is not dirty because Mrs. Wright was a bad housekeeper, but because men have, quote unquote, dirt on their hands. So this is an indication of the guilt of the men in the play. And finally, the most obvious and foregrounded symbol we have in the play is, of course, the bird and the bird cage. So the bird is, it likes to sing, so it kind of represents Mrs. Wright when she was a young girl, when her name was Minnie Foster. And the bird is caged, just as Mrs. Wright is caged. And of course, when Mr. Wright kills the bird by snapping its neck, his death follows soon after in a similar fashion, because the bird really symbolized Mrs. Wright and her joy. Finally, I wanted to pull out some important quotations for you to note. So here we have Mr. Hale speaking to the detectives about what he witnessed on the day of the murder. He says, I'd spoke to Wright about it once before, and here he's talking about a party telephone line. So if you wanted a telephone in the Midwest farmland in the early 1900s, you had to get a lot of people to go in with you on it to make it worthwhile. And the phone would work mostly for neighbors to talk to each other. It wasn't used to call out quite so much. So Mr. Hale has been trying to get Mr. Wright to go in with him and split the cost of one of these. But he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he wanted was peace and quiet. Guess you know about how much he talked himself. So Mr. Hale here is confirming that Mr. Wright was not a pleasant person. He didn't like to talk. He was really quiet. And the women see this as the evidence that it is, but the men dismiss it because it's more emotional and less concrete. But I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife and said all the women folks like the telephones and that in this lonesome stretch of road it would be a good thing, well, I said to Harry that was what I was going to say, though I said at the same time that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John. So here, Mr. Hale is saying that he had hoped maybe if he got Mrs. Wright in on the deal that it would persuade her husband. But then, of course, Mr. Hale knows and says right here that Mr. Hale didn't care one way Mr. Wright didn't care one way or another what his wife wanted. So again, the women pick up on this kind of emotional evidence, but the men don't. I also pulled for you a section here where the men are talking to the women just before they leave the room. So they say to Mrs. Peters, who is, of course, the sheriff's wife, And keep your eye out, Mrs. Peters, for anything that might be of use. No telling, you women might come upon a clue to the motive, and that's the thing we need." Mr. Hale rubbed his face after the fashion of a showman getting ready for a pleasantry. "But would the women know a clue if they did come upon it?" he said. So here we have a little bit of dramatic irony. So the men say, "Oh yeah, maybe the women will find a clue," and we of course know that they will. And Mr. Hale says they wouldn't know a clue if they came on it. Now, this is ironic for a couple of reasons. First of all, the women do find clues and they do know them when they come upon them. And even further ironic is that the men are the ones who don't know the clues when they see them. So the men don't recognize the birdcage for what it is. They don't recognize the marital relationship for what it is. And so a very ironic statement here by Mr. Hale. Finally, I pulled for you this section where the women are kind of worrying and sad for Mrs. Wright because all of her preserves have busted. And the men laugh at this and think it's silly that they're worrying about this. The men say, "Oh, I guess before we're through with her, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about." "Oh, well," said Mrs. Hale's husband with good-natured superiority, "women are used to worrying over trifles." And remember I mentioned that in the play version of this story, it's called Trifles, so it brings a lot of attention to this particular phrase. This is important because the men are laughing at the women for worrying over what they consider to be an unimportant thing, in this case, the preserved fruit and vegetables. They also mock the women similarly for worrying about the quilt. But what we should note here is not only are the preserves and the quilt a kind of evidence, but they're also not unimportant. That preserved food is how people survive, and it takes a huge amount of labor. Quilting, similarly, is a very intricate art form, and again takes an enormous amount of woman hours. And the men dismiss these things as unimportant or women's concerns, when in fact they're hugely important for multiple reasons. So I hope you enjoyed reading A Jury of Her Peers, and if you want to know more about Susan Glaspell, you can feel free to email me and I'll give you more information.